All right, so what we have to do today is go over the second sample midterm. And when that's done, we'll go back to chapter 11. Now, I haven't completely finished writing the second midterm, so when I'll post it pretty soon, but because it's not ready yet, probably it'll be due a week from Monday. Let's put it that way.
Come on, David, class started.
You'll have at least a week to get it done. So yeah, I'm still working on it. So anyway, so let's do this right now. And then probably over the weekend, I'll post the actual midterm. And then let's just say, let me look at the calendar real fast. Because it's not ready yet, so I certainly want you to have at least a week to get it done. Let's see, where are we? This Monday would be the, hold on. Here we go. So today's the 22nd. So Monday, no, that's not what I wanted.
Which chapters exactly are the tests on?
5 through 9.
Okay, just double checking.
Yes, no, that's good. 5 through 9. Here we go. Today's the 22nd. So in other words, wow, that would give you plenty of time. A week from Monday is in May, for God's sakes. It's really zooming along here, isn't it? But that's okay. It's not the worst thing in the world. May the 4th. How about that? So no, actually, no, look at this. This calendar doesn't start on Sunday. That would be Monday the 3rd. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, that day is actually a holiday from Purchase for some reason, but that's all right. You can always just email it to me. So yeah, while we're talking about the subject, it turns out that one of those 3 days that they gave us scattered throughout the calendar is happens to be Monday the 3rd. It seems like an odd choice for a day off, but there it is. So we're not going to say no to that, are we? A day off. So so 2 things will happen on the 3rd. That will be the day you can hand in your second midterm, and that'll also be a day off. So how about that? And then the final exam, we're just going to have to stick to, let's see, let me go get my notes here. Given that we're running out of time, I think the final will just be 11 and 12. I think originally I'd hoped to get into chapter 13 as well, but that's all right. If you take intermediate macroeconomics, chapter 13 would be one of the first topics you would cover anyway. So this way we can just wrap it up with our discussion of money in chapter 11 and the Fed in chapter 12. And that makes a nice logical sequence that can be the basis of the final exam. It will not be comprehensive, okay? Not comprehensive. And I'm sure you're happy to hear that. It'll just be 11 and 12. All right. So anyway, so what we have to get this done, and then we can get back to our discussion about money. And of course, last time we got to see that very interesting series about the history of paper money. We have other videos to show as well, but first we have to cover more material. But right now, let's look at this. Now, this is covering 5 different chapters, so the questions are kind of scattered around all over the place, but we'll start with the business cycle. Now, you might recall that the business cycle has 4 basic components to it, and the order in which you write this doesn't make any real difference, as long as you can show that it goes through these 4 phases. Expansion, where the economy is growing quickly. Peak is where it reaches its highest point in the business cycle. Then it starts to slow down, and we go through what's called a contraction. And then finally, you have a trough, which is the bottom of the cycle. And then the economy starts all over again. Once the trough has been hit, the bottom has been reached, we start to expand again. We reach another peak, and then we go through a contraction and then a trough. So this is how the economy operates over long periods of time. Sometimes the business cycle can be over and done within a year. And sometimes it can take several years to go through all 4 phases of this business cycle. So you never know from one cycle to the next. They're not predictable, to say the least. All right, why are intermediate goods excluded from the calculation of GDP? So if you recall, intermediate goods are not directly consumed, but are instead used as inputs into the production process. So I'm just throwing this in here, by the way. You don't have to do this if on the test. If this question pops up, all you have to do is explain why they're being left out. But I want to give you a quick reminder what intermediate goods actually are. And so, as an example, the wheat that is used to bake bread is an intermediate good. The reason for excluding the value of the bread, not the bread, sorry, the wheat from GDP is that if it is included, it will be counted twice. Once as wheat and once as part of the bread. So in other words, you'd actually be counting it as wheat, and then you would be counting it again as part of the value of the bread that you're producing. So the point of all this is that you leave these out to avoid double counting their value in the GNP or GDP, because otherwise the GDP would appear to be much larger than it actually is. So in other words, let's say the wheat is worth 50 cents, and then that contributes 50 cents to the value of the bread that you are buying. If you count the wheat as wheat separately from the bread, then the wheat would get counted as $1, 50 cents for wheat, and 50 cents is part of the value of the bread. So that's exactly why we don't want this. We want to leave it out to avoid the double counting. So in other words, the short answer is that we leave out intermediate goods to avoid double counting them. All right, that's enough right there. You don't need all this background if you're on the test, but yeah, I just wanted you to remember what this is all about. Now, GDP and GNP, here's what's really different about the two of them. GDP counts the value of goods and services produced within the borders of a country during a given year. Whereas GNP counts the value of goods and services produced by the citizens of a country during a given year. So the key difference is, in the first case, we're only counting products produced within the borders of that country, no matter what the nationality is. And secondly, in GNP, we're only counting what is being produced by the citizens of a country, regardless of where they're located. Okay, so that's the difference between those two. All right, a net factor income receipt. Now, these are in the balance of payments. What is this all about? Well, I'm going to list 4 of them: wages from labor, interest from capital, rent from land, profits from entrepreneurship. You only need one of them in this question, but I wanted to show them all. Okay. Now, what is the only component of GDP that can be negative? That would be net exports. Okay. And just as an aside, net exports will be negative if imports are greater than exports. And of course, this is the only component of GDP where this can actually happen. Now, how long is a durable good designed to last? 3 years or more. That's the official definition given to us by the government. Durable means 3 or more. Non-durable means anything less than that. So I don't know where they came up with that number 3, but normally durable goods are things that are meant to last a long time, like cars and furniture and appliances and computers and that type of thing. Non-durables are the things you buy on a regular basis, like food and clothes and gasoline, let's say, that are not meant to last for a very long time. Now, in which component of GDP are expenditures on new housing found? This is one of the surprising ones. This belongs in investment spending, not consumer spending. All right, so the government considers housing to be a form of investment. And you can kind of see why, because, you know, it's something you're going to own for a very long time. You're going to get a lot of use out of it, and it gains in value over time. So in a way, you could think of it as
My
a
speaker isn't working.
type of investment.
Well,
Oops. All right. Anyhow, what is a transfer payment? This is a payment for which no goods or services will be received. Okay, so what this really means specifically is that, for example, payments by the government, Social Security payments, I should say, or transfer payments. In other words, when you send money to the Social Security recipients, they're not providing you with a good or service. It's simply money sent to them for what they can do whatever they want with it. But we're not expecting anything in return. It's not really a gift because, I mean, they had to qualify for it, but it is the same kind of thing. So it's essentially money that's sent to them without expecting anything in return. Now, with net exports, there's a lot of potential answers to this question, but I think the most important one is exchange rates. That's really one of the most important driving forces behind determining who buys what country's goods and services, because exchange rates ultimately determine how much does it cost us to buy those goods, for foreigners, that is. In other words, for exports, the stronger our currency is, the more expensive it'll be to foreigners to buy our products. So that's one of the most important determinants of net exports. How strong is our currency? Now, the GDP identity it's basically an equation. You might recall Y equals C plus I plus G plus net exports. Okay, and so therefore, we can write it out like this. And you can write it in English if you want to, but I think it's easier to just write it out in this form. All right. Now, what is the difference between real and nominal GDP? Just like any other real and nominal variables, real GDP is adjusted for inflation, while nominal GDP is not. It's really just that simple. Nominal is measured in current dollars.
yeah, I can't hear anything, and I can't even see if they can hear me.
We can.
Not sure why that keeps unmuting itself. Yes. Okay. Anyway, so yes, so nominal, and we'll see an example of this later on, but nominal just really, it means it's being measured in current dollars, and really GDP is measured in what we call constant dollars or base year dollars, which means that we're holding prices constant. Therefore, we're adjusting for inflation to find out if output actually increased or not. All right, now during the base year, real and nominal GDP, and we'll see this again in our example later on, during the base year, real and nominal GDP are equal to each other. And that's because you're using the same prices to calculate both of them. All right, of course, you're using the same quantities, but the prices are identical in the base year. After that, they will be different. All right, now, if somebody who's looked for work in the last 4 weeks, are they considered to be unemployed? Yes. Okay, that means you're part of that number. When you hear it repeated in the media, the unemployment rate is X%. That includes people who have looked for work within the last 4 weeks. That means you're still looking. Maybe you haven't been lucky enough to find something, but you are making the effort. Oh, well, then you're considered to be employed. Right. If you already have a job, then you're considered to be employed. So the fact that you're looking for another job doesn't really affect the measurement. But that's a good question because let's face it, well, you'll discover this in the future. No matter what job you have, you're always keeping your eye at least partially open on the next job. Okay. In other words, once you arrive in a new place, often the first thing you want to wonder about is, well, what do I do next? It's not that uncommon for people to be always at least open to looking for something new. I mean, if you just got there like yesterday, of course not. But I mean, within a year or two, you'll almost certainly be at least thinking about what comes next. But then as long as you're still working, if you don't quit to look for a new job, you're then considered to be employed. All right. So on the other hand, are members of the armed forces considered to be part of the working age population? No, because they're not available to work. In other words, they have a job basically, although it's not considered to be employment. It's kind of a different category altogether. I mean, yes, they're getting paid and yes, they're employed in a sense, but they're not considered to be part of the domestic workforce. Now, discouraged workers, these are people who have stopped looking within, let's say, typically they're counted as being people who looked within the last year, but not the last 4 weeks. So you're discouraged, but you haven't yet completely dropped out altogether. I guess they figure if something exciting comes along, you might say, oh, well, maybe I'll consider that, but you're not actively looking anymore either. You're sort of kind of in limbo, I guess. You're sort of, you know that you don't have a job, but for whatever reason, you're not in a hurry to get another one. And that's fine if you can pull it off. Like George Costanza on Seinfeld, at least half of those episodes, he did not have a job, did he? No. And in fact, there was at least one episode about him having to file with the Unemployment Bureau. And of course, he did his best to make sure that they did not find him a new job. So he's, I guess he would be considered discouraged when he's not working. Anyway, which measure of unemployment is the most narrow? By most narrow, by the way, we mean it includes the fewest people in it. Well, that's U1. All right, U1, to be considered unemployed in U1, it's a very rigid definition. U6 is the other extreme. Many people count as unemployed in U6 that do not count in U3 or U1. So we call this the most narrow measure. And at the other extreme, we have U6. This one includes a lot more people as being unemployed. In fact, there's a chart that shows us, I think in one of the chapters, let's see if I've got that open right here. Nope, it must have been chapter 6 then, hold on. Oh, it is open, okay. There we go. There's U1 through 6. And you can see U1 always has the lowest unemployment rate because it includes the fewest people, or it counts the fewest people as being unemployed, whereas U6 counts the most. U6 includes, well, U1, you have to have been unemployed for at least 15 weeks to be considered unemployed. So that's a pretty tight definition. That's why it's so low. U6, on the other hand, oh man, it includes the unemployed, the discouraged, the other marginally attached, the involuntarily part-time. In other words, they're trying to scoop up everybody basically who's not working full-time and count them as unemployed. So there's a lot of people in U6 that would not be counted in any of the other measures. And of all of these, the one that is considered to be the quote official measure is U3. All right, so when you hear them talking about in the media, oh, the unemployment rate last month was 6.2%, they're talking about U3. All right, now suppose a recent college graduate has not yet found his or her first job. What type of unemployment do we call this? This would be frictional. Okay, there's friction. The job market is not perfect. In fact, it's kind of inefficient. It's probably one of the most inefficient markets out there. And that's, you can kind of see why, because it's kind of hard to match up people with jobs. There's always a lot of gray area. And sometimes companies are very stubborn about what they're looking for, and they won't budge on the requirements. And other times personalities get in the way, and it can be tough. Okay, so it's not quick. It can be a very long process to find a job. So we call that frictional unemployment to indicate that there's friction in the labor market. And it really can't be helped to a certain degree. Although with the advent of online job services, like monster.com, for example, where people can post resumes on the internet and as opposed to having to visit companies, that certainly has helped, but you'll never completely get rid of frictional unemployment. You can't, like, the process can't be completely put on the internet because, the reality is no matter what your credentials are, let's face it, you really can't be hiring people who have personalities that don't mesh with the rest of your company. That could be a real problem. So that kind of thing can only be discovered through interviews. And so that part, unfortunately, will always be part of the job search process. And that certainly makes things take a lot longer. But anyway, so suppose a software engineer lost his job only because the economy is in recession. What kind of unemployment is this? That would be cyclical. This is a person with obviously very high skills who's in demand, but the companies that he worked for, something went wrong. Maybe they went out of business. And so now he's out looking. Okay. But this is directly attributable to the business cycle, whereas the college graduate, even if the economy is booming, it's going to take a while to land that first job. All right, now the natural rate of unemployment is what we mean by the rate of unemployment that occurs when there is no cyclical unemployment. Okay, in other words, when everybody's who wants a job, who has the right skills, has a job. Nobody's out of work because of the economy, then we say that we've reached the natural rate of unemployment. Now, the actual value of this thing, well, opinions have differed over the years. For many years, it was thought that this could never go below 5%, but a couple of years ago, before the COVID, the unemployment rate was down around 3.5%. So clearly 5% was not correct. And it may very well be that this rate continues to change as productivity changes. All right, the output gap is basically the difference between potential GDP and actual GDP. So potential, remember, is the GDP that we could achieve if no resources are being wasted. Okay, so in other words, it's like, there's always some potential that we could theoretically reach, and where we actually are. The difference between the two is referred to as the output gap. Now, for the CPI, the base year is defined to have a value of 100, so that it's easy to interpret what the CPI is telling us. So if whatever year you're in, the CPI is at 110, that means prices have risen by 10% compared to the base year. All right, how about this? Ooh, the CPI. Now, the CPI does have problems, but so does every other measure out there. There's no such thing as a perfect measure of the economy. They all have issues. But what specifically is wrong with the CPI? Well, I'm going to list a bunch of them, even though it only asks for one. The CPI does not measure all goods and services available to consumers. Some are left out because they have a basket of goods which they've defined, and anything that's not in that basket is not being counted. All right, and they can't possibly capture everything. So not everything is in there. They hope that what they have in their basket represents the most important goods and services that we buy, but it does not include everything. Also, the CPI does not capture the impact of new goods, all right, because they're not in the basket. Okay, the CPI does not capture the beneficial effect of quality improvements. So in other words, if you're looking at computers that were built in 2000 versus now, the CPI counts them both as computers without being able to take into account the fact that the new computers are much better than the old ones. So, they look at the prices and that's all they're really doing. They're saying, how much does a computer cost now versus 20 years ago or whatever the year was? So they're not able to take into account the fact that some products improve over time, so that even if the price went up a little bit, you might be better off because the quality has improved so much. So it might give you a distorted view as to how much the cost of living is changing. And then finally, we also know, here's one of the biggies. The CPI cannot capture the cost savings that would result if consumers switch from expensive products to cheaper products. So in other words, if the price of, let's say, beef goes up, the CPI doesn't adjust the weights very often. And so it would appear that people are continuing to spend the same proportion of their incomes on beef, when in reality, they might be switching to chicken or to fish and thereby saving money. So the CPI would, in that case, give a distorted view of how much the cost of living is actually going up. Because, consumers are smart. They see that there's other options available and they switch around depending on prices. So then there's a tendency for the CPI to overstate the true cost of living. Although it's not very much. I mean, it's something like 0.1% is what they think it is. But, it's not a large amount, but still it can pile up. For example, the Social Security system is tied to CPI. The payments go up every year according to CPI. And if it's overstating the true cost of living, then the retirees are pretty happy because they're being paid more of an increase than is justified by actual increases in prices of goods and services. So they're getting a little bit of a bonus there. And then union contracts might be tied to CPI, and other types of contracts might be tied to the CPI. And that means that they'll be off because the CPI somewhat overstates the true cost of living. Okay, but they're working on it. They're constantly figuring out ways to improve the CPI. And, but there's certain things that will always be a problem. Like, this is a massive undertaking. And so it's going to always be a challenge to correctly price all those goods and services in the market that people, they think people are actually buying. So, I mean, they do their best, but there will always be issues. So how about this? Which school of thought holds that markets are self-correcting? That would be the classical economics, which basically we're including like Adam Smith and people like that in this category. The ones who were writing during the American Revolution up through the 19th century, that markets are self-correcting, that government has very little role in the economy, that any problems that arise can take care of themselves without government intervention. Okay, so that was pretty much the prevailing view for at least 100 years. Now, what about the school of thought that attributes business cycles to fluctuations in the money supply? That, of course, would be the monetarists. The name gives it away, doesn't it? The monetarists, they had their day in the 80s and the 90s. It's not that they're not influential now, but that's when they really were the new game in town, so to speak, because they came along after the late 70s when inflation had become really out of control in the United States. And so the monetarists were the ones who said, we have to do something different here. And we have to focus our attention on the money supply and try to keep it under control to keep prices from rising too quickly. And so it worked very well. And they did get rid of a lot of the inflation in the economy. But now, policy is conducted more as a mixed bag of this idea and that idea and everything. But during the 80s, policy really was being conducted largely with the advice of the monetarists. Now, potential GDP, did I ask this question twice? Potential GDP is what can be produced when no resources are wasted. But you could also explain it as saying when there is no cyclical unemployment. It means the same thing. Okay. What does the total product curve show? This shows the amount of output that can be produced with different levels or different amounts of a variable input, such as labor, when no resources are being wasted. These are all points of maximum efficiency. All right, so we typically assume that labor is variable. So when we change the amount of labor that we're using with different or fixed amounts of capital and other resources, the total product curve shows us how much output we can produce at every level of that labor. Now, what happens to the total product curve when technology improves? It shifts upward to indicate, just to show that more output is being produced at every level of labor. So a typical case would look like this. I'll call that TP1. And then here, let's call that TP2. They don't have to be perfectly parallel to each other. As long as the second one is higher than the first one, that's all we needed to show. All right, now it doesn't ask you to draw this, but I thought I'd like to remind you what this looks like. Now, here's the last fill-in question. What is real per capita GDP? And all it means is that this equals real GDP divided by the size of the population. All right, so those are our short fill-ins. They weren't too painful, I don't think. They covered a lot of territory, but no, they weren't too bad. A lot of them are pretty self-explanatory. So then we get to do some problems. Numbers, woohoo. All right. So
Can we go to 30 for a second? I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay, I'm done.
All right, good. All right, so now we've got a small economy, and I mean small. They only make two things, wine and cheese. Okay, this could be some tiny little country and embedded in the border between France and Spain, like Andorra, let's say, or Liechtenstein. These are tiny, tiny little countries that are tucked away in between these two countries, Spain and France. And they obviously don't produce a ton of products, but let's say that they're in the business of making cheese and wine. That's all they make. And everybody's happy. So what we want to know, though, is their economy growing or not? So we're going to calculate some measures. So first, let me view by splitting the screen so we can see the table at all times. Oh, by the way, we're going to assume that 2019 is the base year. Okay, that's an important detail because that'll help us speed up our calculations a little bit. So for A, the 2019 nominal GDP is going to represent the actual cost of buying these products in 2019. So in other words, what are we doing here? It's, oh, okay. 2019 nominal GDP is constructed from 2019 prices and 2019 quantities. So how do I get that? So first I'm going to go look at the cheese. That costs $10 a pound. And I'm multiplying it by 3,000 pounds. And then for the wine in 2019, it cost $12 a gallon. And I made 6,000 gallons. And so that's 30,000 from the cheese, 72,000 from the wine. And so my economy produces $102,000 worth of these products. That's my 2019 nominal GDP. Now, since 2019 is the base year, 2019 real GDP is also constructed from 2019 prices and 2019 quantities. So I basically don't have to do anything else except copy this all over again. So in the base year, as we already have seen, they have to be equal to each other because we always use the current year quantities. What changes between nominal and real is that with real, we always use the base year prices. But since 2019 is the base year, that means that both of them have to be the same. All right, now, how about, now this is where it gets more interesting. What about 2020 nominal GDP? It is constructed.
Gonna be the same as the pace?
Is it what?
Is it gonna be the same as the pace for 2019?
No, it's not going to be equal to either one. It'll be different from both of them.
Okay.
Because here's what we're doing. We're actually now ignoring this part of the chart. All right, we're only focusing now on these numbers. Okay, so it'll be 11 for the cheese times 3,500 pounds plus 13 for the wine times 6,500 gallons. And so that equals 35,000 plus 78,000 equals 113,000. So, you know what I'm going to do, just to add one more explanatory note here. Watch this. And this is the 2019 price of cheese times the 2019 quantity of cheese. I might as well do this for all the cases. I want it to be crystal clear what we're doing here. All right, so in other words, yeah, I'll sneak this in here too, so you can go back and say, oh, I see what you did. So, and it's the same, of course, for this one. Okay, but now all of a sudden, look what's different. All of these have been replaced with 2020. Oops. Okay, so when you go back and look at this later on, you can say, where did those numbers come from? Oh, I get it. So it's everything 2020. And then in part D, we have real 2020 real GDP is constructed from 2019 prices and 2020 quantities. That's the interesting part right there. I draw your attention to this. Those are the base year prices. So we use those, but we always use the current quantities. That part never changes. All right, so if that's the case, what are we getting from this? We're getting the cheese in 2019 cost $10. The quantity, though, in 2020 was 3,500 pounds. Then for the wine, 12 times 6,500 equals 35,000 plus 78,000 equals 113,000. So let me add that below here. Where did this come from? It was the 2019 price of cheese times the 2020 quantity of cheese, way over here on the right. And then for the wine, we use the 2019 price of the wine times the 2020 quantity of wine. And that's where these numbers came from. Nice. So all four of them are now right there in front of you. And so what we still want to calculate is E, the percentage change, or by what percent has nominal GDP risen since the base year. Okay, so the percentage change in nominal GDP, in this case would be 2020 nominal GDP minus 2019 nominal GDP all over 2019 nominal GDP. All right, so let's go back and remind ourselves 2020 nominal GDP is 113,000. Okay. 2019 nominal was 102,000. Oh, wait a minute. Did I do something wrong here? I think I copied the wrong number. Yeah, I did. Something's not right. This is wrong right here. Sorry, I just realized there's a screw up right here. 2020 nominal is 123,000. These numbers are right, aren't they? No, they're not. Sorry, I completely screwed up this one. It's this part is fine. I was just copying the wrong thing. 11 times 3,500 plus 13 times 6,500 is 38,500 plus 84,500. Yeah, that's more like it. So nominal GDP in 2020 is actually 123,000, not 113. So change that in your notes right there. Sorry about that. And now we can calculate these correctly. All right, so that was just, this part was fine, but then my eyes went astray and I looked at the wrong part of the document, and suddenly, so this is correct now. And if you notice too, this is what should have been the tip off. In 2020, the nominal GDP should be higher than real GDP anyway. So you can see that we had 123,000 nominal GDP and 113,000 real GDP. That's how it should work. Very good. All right. And up here, of course, it doesn't matter. They're both the same no matter what. All right. So let's try that again. It's 123,000. Previously, it was 102,000. And we divide all that by 102,000. And that gives me 0.206, which means 20.6%. But the question is, how much of that represents actual increase in the production of goods and services? Because if you look at the chart, you'll see that both wine and cheese became more expensive in 2020. So some of that is just due to the prices. The question is how much? So therefore, for F, the percentage change in real GDP, same thing, 2020 real GDP minus 2019 nominal GDP, all is divided by 2019 nominal GDP. What am I doing? It's real. It's all real. Real, all over real. It's all real in this equation. So what would that be? That would be 113,000 minus 102,000 all over 102,000, which is clearly a much smaller number, 10.8%. So you can see of all of that increase in nominal GDP, at least half of it was due to real GDP, which means roughly half of it was due to inflation. So that's why we always want to pay attention not to nominal GDP, but real GDP, because it tells us how much output is growing. And that's the only thing that really matters. All right. So that should be good. All right. Now, the next one is easy by comparison. Based on the expenditures approach, what is GDP for this economy in 2020? Now, remember, this is based on the expenditures approach, the simpler one. There is an incomes approach, but it's really messy. So all you have to do here is pick out the important components. C, for example, is here at 5,000. I is 900 right here. G, government expenditures on goods and services, 2,000. And then finally net exports. Ooh, as we said before, that one can actually be negative, and it is here. So when you add up all these numbers, what do you get? Say 5,000 plus 900 plus 2,000 minus 800 is $7,100. Now, it's not as small as it sounds. These are all meant to be billions of dollars. So whatever this economy is, let's say it's not the US, it's still, this is $7.1 trillion.
So is the I investment or interest?
Oh, you know, that's a good question. I didn't even notice that. This I is supposed to be an investment. Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that. Yes. C is consumption spending. Yeah, I'll have to keep an eye on that in the future. I is investment spending. G is government expenditures on goods and services, not transfer payments, as we've already seen. And then finally, NX, of course, is net exports. So all this other information is really meant for the incomes approach, but we're not doing that. We're only doing the expenditures approach. So you can basically ignore them. They don't have any bearing because they overlap with each other. And so this is how we identify how much has been spent on all final goods and services, which translates into the value of those products. Okay. Now here we've got some more calculations to do with the unemployment rate. So we know that the population is 320 million. The working age population is 180 million, which means there's 140 million people who are not eligible for the workforce, people under 16, for example, or people who are retired or in the military or in jail or in the hospital. So of the remaining people who are theoretically available for work, we have 135 million who are employed and 20 million unemployed. The rest would just be considered to be not part of the labor force at all. We don't know what they're doing, but they're not part of the labor force. All right. So the labor force is very easy to calculate. It's total employed plus total unemployed, or 135 million. We don't need to include the millions every time. Maybe we will. All right, that's okay. Total unemployed is 20 million. So that gives us a workforce of 155 million. B, the unemployment rate is defined as total unemployed, not over the population, but over the labor force. So we know that the unemployed are 20 million. We also know that we just got through calculating that the labor force is 155 million. So therefore, that would be 12.9%. Ooh, that's pretty steep. C, the employment to population ratio, which is not one of the more popular measures, but you see it once in a while. Employment population ratio is total employed over working age population. So we know that 135 million people are working. Working age population is 180 million. And that ratio is 0.75, 75%. And then finally for D, we have the labor force participation rate is defined as the size of the labor force divided by working age population. We already know that the labor force we calculated to be 155 million. We were told that the working age population is 180 million, and that's going to be 0.86 or 86%. Ooh, that was a lot of calculations. Okay, so those are done. Now all we need is a couple of graphs to wrap it up. So the labor market, we can think of the vertical axis as being real wages. All right, what's going on here? Wow, I don't know what's going on. All of a sudden, it's just bouncing around on me. That's very annoying. Yeah, something weird is going on here. It's just up and down. What the hell is going on here? I've never seen this before. Jesus Christ. There's always something wrong with the technology. You can't count on technology ever. Yes, I is investment and not interest. That's absolutely correct. For this application right here, I is meant to be investment. Okay. Yeah, so my document is acting up on me here. I don't know what the problem is. All of a sudden, it's just bouncing up and down, so I can't draw on it. It's very annoying. I just don't know what's going on. I'm gonna save this document and then close it out. Unbelievable. Usually the best way to deal with anything on a computer that's giving you trouble is to just reboot it. That takes care of a lot of problems, but I don't want to do that right now. Oh, you know what I wanted to do? I wanted to boldface these. Yep, so let's see if it's still doing it. Yep, it's still acting up. Look at that. I wonder if it's the tablet that's doing it. All right. No. It's determined. I guess there's nothing I can do about it until I reboot the computer. It's just going to be a headache. So I'll do what I can. Unbelievable. So the supply of labor goes up. I'm doing the best I can. Anyway, what we wanted to see is that the wage goes down. More people are working, but the real wage goes down. And then in part B, we're going to show what, now we've already basically done this, but I'll try it again. What happens to the total product of labor curve when technology improves? It shifts up. Okay, but here it specifically asks you to draw the picture. So I'm going to give it a shot. Okay, so the curve shifts up. That's all we needed to know. Okay, I guess that's the best we're going to get out of this. So, all right, we're done with this. So now we can go back and revisit our discussion about money. All right, so I'll post these and I'll get the midterm up by the weekend, and then you can have until a week from that Monday to get it done. Okay, so that should be fine. You should have plenty of time. All right, now where's that chapter 11? Now we haven't gone through this in a while. Where did we leave off? We defined money and all the different forms that it can take and all the features, but where we left off, no, actually they both have to start at zero because that's where labor is zero. Okay, I'm glad I was not able to draw it as well as I should have. They start at zero because that's where labor is zero. There can't be any product with no labor. But once they go up, the curves can be, well, thanks, considering. When it goes up, it can go up in a non-parallel fashion. As long as the new one is completely above the old one, then that's fine. But yes, they do both have to start at zero because that's where there's no labor. All right. So yes, where we left off was what we did not do is define the money supply. Now, you may have heard this term before. The money supply represents, of course, how much money is there in the U.S. economy. So the answer to that question is it depends. It depends on what definition of the money supply you're using. Now, the Federal Reserve System in the past has created several different definitions for money. There really are only two being currently used. So we'll focus on those two, and they're called M1 and M2. So what exactly do we mean by M1 and M2? M1, for all practical purposes, it has more. Let me just show you real fast. M1 actually consists of currency in circulation, which means those green pieces of paper in your wallet, plus the coins in your pocket or in your desk drawer, wherever they are. Checking deposits. And then these last two, which are much, much smaller, and you don't see them very often anymore. We have what are called traveler's checks and negotiable orders of withdrawal. I'm not sure what percentage those represent of the total. It's very, very small. Often when we analyze the money supply, we think of M1 primarily as just simply currency in circulation plus checking deposits. So that's what we'll stick with right now. So you're probably wondering, how big is the money supply right now? Let's find out. So we're going to go back to our old friend Fred. And now they apparently have redefined it slightly. Like it says here, May 2020. Apparently the Fed made some changes to it. So the series I'm about to show you is no longer being updated. They've apparently found something else to take its place. Why don't we just look at the last, let's say 10 years or so. Oh no, that's not what I wanted. Well, all right, here's the bottom line. The last time they reported this, the total amount of M1 money in the US economy was about $18 trillion. Does that sound like a lot? Oh, here it is. M1SL is what they've replaced it with. Well, we can look it up later on. What? See, they do have it. I don't know what SL is supposed to stand for, by the way. Let's just go back for 10 years. Oh no, you know what the problem is? They only just started using it. All right. Well, we won't be able to tell how fast it's growing, but what we can see here is that it's around $18 trillion. Does that sound like a lot? I don't know. It's such a big economy. I guess not. $18 trillion worth of currency and checking deposits to support the US economy. Now, M2 is basically a broader definition of M1. It consists of M1 itself, plus we add to it savings deposits, like your savings account, time deposits, where these are basically savings accounts where you have to keep your money in the bank for a fixed length of time. And then we have something called money market deposit accounts for individuals. Basically, these are funds that are invested in short-term liquid instruments like treasury bills. And you can actually enter into a deposit where your interest is determined by this money market account. All of this is considered to be M2. And so, as far as I know, M2 is still being measured by the Fed. Why don't we find out how much bigger M2 is than M1? All right, let's try it. Remember, this is around 18 trillion. M2, oh my God, they changed that one too, didn't they? Just our luck, huh?
M1, M2 would change by definition, right?
Yeah, that's true. It would have to, because M2 is meant to include M1. So if we have a new M2, it has to include the new M1. Now, this one is about $19 trillion. Okay, that's a little bigger. Not as much as I expected, that's for sure. But I think the definitions that I'm showing you are now, I guess, outdated because they're talking about M1SL and M2SL. This is what they were for like decades. And now all of a sudden they had to change them. Just our luck. But this is what for many decades M1 and M2 were meant to represent. So but the bottom line here is that M1 is what we would call a more liquid measure of money, which means that these are assets that are acceptable just about everywhere. Whereas here in M2, we see some of these assets are not terribly liquid because, like for example, the savings deposit, in order to spend that money, you have to go through the formality of withdrawing it. Time deposits, you have to leave the money there for a fixed length of time. And then these money market deposits, often these have restrictions on how often you can withdraw money from them. So clearly, currency and checking deposits are the most liquid forms of money. And so M1 is defined to be the most liquid form. I'll look into and see what they've done to them and why. They're researchers, they have an army of researchers. They must have sat down and said, listen, is there a better way to measure the money supply? And they said, oh, here we go. Here's a new measure that should work. And there you go. Now that's what they're using. They have their reasons. Now we're going to introduce also this interesting concept called the monetary base. So the monetary base consists of what we call reserves in the banking system, total reserves. What happens with this is that the banks are required by the Fed to keep some of their deposits in an account with the Fed, and those accounts are referred to as reserves or reserve accounts. And the idea here is that that money cannot be lent out to customers. Why is the Fed doing this? Because they want to make sure that the system doesn't run out of money. In other words, they don't want a situation where people ask for their money and the bank doesn't have it. Because I'm sure you're well aware of the fact that when you put your money in the bank, they immediately lend it out to somebody else. So almost all of their deposits have already been lent out to somebody else. So you don't want to have any runs on the banking system where everybody asks for their money back at the same time and it's just not there. So in order to maintain the safety of the banking system, the Fed requires the banks to keep a small percentage of their deposits in these reserve accounts. But those reserve accounts actually belong to the banks. They don't belong to the Fed. They're just kept there for safety purposes. And the Fed does pay them a little bit of interest on these reserve accounts, but not very much. And then finally, we have currency in circulation, C, and that again refers to notes and coins. The ones that are in your pocket, hopefully, as we speak. And all of this is collectively known as the monetary base. And so while we're looking, let's check out and see. The monetary base should be smaller than either M1 or M2. Okay, this one doesn't seem to have been discontinued, to my great surprise. Yeah, it's only about $5.4 trillion. It's definitely smaller than the money supply. Interesting. Okay, anyway, so now finally at long last, we get to introduce the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System, or the Fed as it's often called, is the central bank of the United States. It has a lot of important duties, which we'll discuss as we go along. Now, before the Fed was created in 1913, there were two previous attempts at having a central bank. And you can see the names of them right there. The First Bank of the United States, which ran from 1791 to 1811. And the reason why it only has 20 years there is because Congress granted it a charter that only lasted for 20 years. They weren't sure if it was a good idea, so they decided that just to be on the safe side, we'll give it a 20-year charter and see how it works out. Now, of course, you can see there's a 5-year gap between that and the creation of the second bank. It took 5 years to get the support back together again to provide a charter for the second bank of the United States. It was not a terribly popular institution. But remember, this is in the early 18th century. The Industrial Revolution is just getting started, and the US is still really an agricultural economy. And so the need for this bank wasn't really clear to everybody. The original first bank was really the idea of Alexander Hamilton, who you all know, who's now suddenly famous again because of that play. He was the first Secretary of the Treasury of the United States under George Washington, and he was very, let's just say his understanding of banking was very advanced. And his goal was to essentially stimulate the US into becoming a major world power. And he figured the best way to do that was to have a central bank in order to, because at that time, realistically, the country was operating as if it were 13 independent countries. Each state had an enormous amount of power, and the federal government had very little power. So Hamilton's trying to do something about that by pushing some of the power back into Washington by creating a central bank. And it was reasonably successful. It was kind of a strange creation because it was actually privately owned. But the reason why it was called the central bank is because it kept deposits from the federal government, and it also paid their bills. So in other words, if they owed money to somebody, they would write a check on the First Bank of the United States. So they acted as an agent for the federal government, but it was also a private bank. So it was very different than what we have now. And then after the new charter was given to the second bank, it lasted for another 20 years. And then that was the end of it. Now, part of the reason why that one wasn't renewed was because of extreme opposition from someone whose name you may know. I'll give you a hint as to who this gentleman was. $20 bill.
Andrew Jackson.
That's right, Andrew Jackson. He hated the central bank. He hated the Bank of the United States. He was, his background, he was sort of, he grew up in the woods of Tennessee, I think. And he had an intense distrust of bankers. He felt that they were basically trying to take advantage of the rest of the population. They had too much power, too much influence, and he felt like the country would be better off without a central bank. So he did his best to make sure that Congress did not renew the charter, and they did not. Well, it was a very, very bitter fight. Yeah, he might not appreciate it, but he's not around to see it. But yeah, I'm not so sure how he would have reacted to the Federal Reserve System putting him on the $20 bill. But he was an interesting character. He was a very down-to-earth kind of guy. In fact, if you had business with Andrew Jackson at that point in time, you literally could just walk up to the White House and knock on that front door, and he would come down there and meet you in person to find out what you needed. It was like that kind of a person. You know, he's very much down to earth, a friend of the little guy, you know, that kind of thing. He hated bankers with a passion, among other things. So another interesting thing about Jackson was that he hated debt as well. He really hated it. He pushed very hard, and during his administration, the US, for the very last time, was debt-free. He paid off all their bills. He managed to get that done, and he felt really proud of himself. He would have been turning over in his grave if he could see how much debt we have now, that's for sure. So yeah, he had an interesting career. In fact, he actually had injuries from duels that he fought. He was one person you do not question his integrity, let's say. I mean, he would fight a duel with anyone. So he was kind of an interesting guy. But anyway, so the charter is not renewed in 1836. And after that, there was never any political will to have a new one. They just never got around to creating a new one. And so because of that, the economy in the United States during the latter half of the 19th century was pretty chaotic, to say the least. Anytime the economy started to slow down or if there was inflation, there was no central bank to do anything about it. And not only that, but there was no central bank to issue currency. So it turns out that during this period, individual states were allowed to issue their own currencies. And not only that, but individual banks were able to issue their own currencies. So we had all these different currencies floating around together. And I'm sure those days were very interesting because it would be hard to judge what a particular dollar was worth. I mean, imagine you're in New York City and somebody gives you a dollar bill issued by the state of North Carolina. Is it worth a New York dollar? Who knows? It's hard to say. So it was a very interesting period. In fact, the other day I was looking around on Google to see if I can find an example of this. And I was having a lot of trouble, but yeah, I found one. Here we go. This note was issued by, here it is, Stonington Bank. Stonington is a small town in Connecticut. This is the Bank of Stonington, and this was circulating side by side with all the other currency in the country. It's a Stonington Bank dollar bill. Man, that's interesting. So, by the way, when we were looking at the San Francisco Fed website the other day, one of the categories that I did not quite get around to showing you They do have some examples of this in their collection. Let's see if I can find one right now. No, maybe not. I thought they might have. Oh, this is so disappointing. Well, let's try early banking in the United States. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe we have some. Miners Bank of Savings of Alta, California. This note is worth 25 cents in gold dust. This was issued in just before the Civil War. Look at that. 25 cents worth of gold dust, presumably deposited in this bank in California. And this would have circulated as money side by side with notes and coins issued by the federal government. What else do we have here? Rhode Island. This is a $3 bill issued by the state of Rhode Island in 1800. Interesting. I can't really read that one. Oh my God. The Franklin Bank, $10. The Franklin Bank of Boston, $10. This is issued in 1826. Man. Now, this actually was issued by the Second Bank of the United States, $2,000 in 1840. After the charter expired, their notes still circulated as money. The bank still existed, it's just that it wasn't considered to be the central bank of the United States. Man. Oh, here's another one. This is issued by the first and second banks. Man. Look at that, a $3,000 bill. I bet that bought a lot, and a $5,000 bill. This probably could have bought 10 houses in those days. So yes, so with no central bank, we've got all these different currencies trading next to each other side by side. And if anything goes wrong in the economy, there's no central bank to help try to change interest rates to try to stabilize the economy. So the economy went through many different ups and downs. There were several recessions during the latter half of the 19th century, and there were also a couple of depressions. And so let's just say the economy was pretty unstable in those days. Anyway, but along comes 1913, the Fed is created, and it's been around ever since. What are the jobs of the Federal Reserve System? Well, they regulate the banking system. Now, banking in the US is very different than other countries because in the US, oh yes, go ahead, Mayed.
I have a dollar coin that was issued in 1873, and it says the United States of America. I don't know. Was issued.
Yes, that at that time there was no central bank, but the Treasury Department would have issued that.
Okay.
So yeah, the central and the Treasury Department would have been responsible for that one. They still continue to issue their own coins and notes, but not through the central bank.
Okay.
So yes, that the Treasury Department would have issued that one. By the way, hang on to that. It might be worth a lot of money.
Yeah, I have two of them actually.
Oh, well, the thing about old coins is if there's a lot of them minted, they may not be worth a whole lot, but you never know. I would check that out if I were you.
Yeah. Well.
Potentially be very expensive. But anyway, yes. So yes, they regulate in the United States. The individual states regulate the banks, and then the Federal Reserve also regulates them. So they're being hit with regulations from the Federal Reserve and the states. So it's a very complex system. Most countries, the regulation comes from the government, the federal government. You don't have actual states also regulating banks like this. The Fed also acts as a lender of last resort, which means that if a bank is in trouble, they can borrow funds from the Fed. They issue the notes that we use. The coins actually technically come from the Treasury Department, and they're printed or minted, I should say, at the US mints in Philadelphia and Denver. Now, for many years, the coins issued at the Philadelphia Mint just had a date on them with no mint mark. Now they show the letter P on them. So if you have any coins in your pocket, you can find very quickly and easily whether or not your coin came from Philadelphia. Let's see if we can get one in here. That's a recent development. I forgot when they switched over, but previously they just left it blank. So historical US mints, pennies and coins struck prior to 1980, there it is, 1980, do not carry Philadelphia mint marks except for the Susan B. Anthony dollars, wartime Jefferson nickels, and any pennies struck in 2017, huh? But anyway, yes, so those are either P or none. And the only other one that's active right now is Denver, where you get a D, although some of the older ones may have no mark on it. San Francisco, until fairly recently, was also minting US coins. In 1975, though, they switched over to only collectible coins, which are not meant for general circulation. But we've had others. Carson City, Nevada, for example. Now, this made a lot of sense because, as you may know, Nevada is a major source of silver deposits. A lot of our silver comes from Nevada. And so at this time, coins are being made out of silver. So it stands to reason that they would locate a mint in Nevada because it's near all the silver. It didn't last that long, only about 25 years for some reason. There also was one in New Orleans, and it's not there anymore, of course. I mean, the building is still there. It's a museum now, but they don't produce coins any longer. And then we have a few others as well. But right now, all of these coins are coming from Philadelphia or Denver. And if you look at the mint marks on them, most of your coins should either contain a D or a P, which will tell you where it came from. If you have any really older coins in your pocket that came from San Francisco, they would have a little S next to them. So yeah, anyway, here's yeah, here it is. That's it. Now, of course, you can actually still, except for the COVID, when that's over, you can go in there and visit, as long as you're willing to stand on a long line and see them actually making the coins. It's pretty cool. I've done it. And it's a lot of fun. Anyway, and they also, this is the most important part of the Fed's duties, they conduct monetary policy, which we'll explain as we go along. Now, the Federal Reserve System is very unique in the world. It is actually a system of 12 district Federal Reserve banks. The point of it was that originally the system was envisioned as a system of independent central banks. Now, it didn't really work out that way, but there are 12 of them to this day scattered around the country. And you can see the names of the districts. And of course, one of them is in New York City. It has to be because they're right in the financial district. And the Board of Governors listed there is in Washington, and they oversee the entire system. Now, every dollar bill, $1 bill that is, that you have in your pocket illustrates or tells you on there which of these Federal Reserve systems or banks issued your dollar bill. Okay, so in other words, how do you know? Let's see, let's get out a picture of a dollar bill. All right, like this one, for example. Oh, where did it go? Here we go. See that letter D there? That means that it came from the Cleveland Fed. Okay. So, all right, well, here we go. There we go. And you can see in the seal there, under the letter D, it actually says the words Cleveland, Ohio. Look at that. How do you like that? So not the higher dollar bill, not the 5 and the 10 and all the rest, but the ones all identify which of the Federal Reserve banks issued that note. So this would have been printed at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing in Washington, but then it would have been distributed to the Cleveland Fed, and they were the ones who would have distributed to the banks in that region. And so then it works its way into circulation and it ends up in your pocket where you take it out and admire it and say, wow, I like this. Whoa, what's that? Cleveland, Ohio. How do you like that? Well, now I know where this dollar bill came from the Cleveland Fed. So if you look in your pocket, you probably got a bunch of other ones, and you can identify it by the letter, or you can simply read what it says down there. And altogether, there are 12 of them covering the entire country. Now, if you look at this map, by the way, look how tiny the districts are in the East Coast, and look how gigantic they are in the West. Why do you suppose this happened? What do you think would be the reason for having gigantic districts in the West and tiny districts in the East? No ideas?
More money in the urban centers.
Well, it's not so much the money, it's the people. They were trying to have an equal distribution of populations. This is 1913. Hardly anybody lives on the West Coast. And so this reflected the populations of the country in 1913 when the Fed was created. So all those states on the West Coast all belong to the San Francisco Fed, including Alaska and Hawaii, because there was very few people lived in the West Coast in those days. Now, of course, that's changed dramatically since then, but they're not going to change these districts. So they will forever stay like this. And but at the time, this was a pretty good representation of what the population looked like in the United States. Anyway, so now I have a trivia question for you. And you might be able to tell by looking at this map, just by a ridiculous coincidence, two of the Federal Reserve banks ended up in the same state. What state am I talking about? Ooh. Let's see how sharp you are today with your geography knowledge. Oh my, it's not, I'll give you a hint, it's not an obvious one. It's not the first one that jumps into your mind. I'll give you a hint. Oh, here we go. Somebody, all right, here we go. Go ahead.
Is it Virginia?
No, nice try though. That's right. Oh, somebody asked about Britain accepting Confederate currency became worthless after the war was over. So yes, all of that money would have been lost to the British. If they held Confederate dollars, they would have become worthless once the war was over. So that's a good question. No, all right, I'll tell you, it's Missouri. St. Louis clearly is in Missouri. Kansas City, there's two Kansas cities. One is in Kansas, but the bigger one is in Missouri. So Kansas City and St. Louis are both in Missouri. So that's the only state that has two Federal Reserve District banks. Not New York, not California, Missouri. How do you like that? It was just a historical accident, but it's kind of a fun question. When I ask it, it's a tough one because, like I said, it's not the first one that jumps into your mind. The reason why you might have said Virginia is because I think you're including the Board of Governors. That's actually in Washington, D.C. And it's not one of the 12 district banks. That's a separate entity. It's like I said, it actually is running the entire Federal Reserve System. So anyway, so this is a good point to stop because the Fed is a very complicated structure. We want to spend some time understanding it, what they do. And I think I might have a couple of videos about this anyway. So we'll stop here. I'll get the midterm posted during the weekend so you can have until May the 3rd to finish it because it's late. And but in the meantime, you might want to read ahead about what's going on in chapter 11 and 12, our discussion about money in the Federal Reserve System. So anyway, so I'll see you all on Monday then.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks. Bye.
Have a great
Thank
weekend,
you. Have a
Professor.
great weekend.
All right, bye.